Dreams, a phenomena which fascinates us and often terrifies us, sometimes at the exact same time. Descartes thought about dreams, and in considering how convincing and realistic dreams can be for us, brought the idea that we might not know if we're dreaming or waking, that an evil dream demon of sorts might have us in a dream against our will and knowledge. Sigmund Freud tried to give psychology an account of dreams, one which entailed subliminal and deep feelings, anxieties, instincts, and desires hidden in the unconscious that could be revealed by a psychoanalytic method, one of his own creation. But Freud's account of psychoanalysis and dreams would eventually be rejected. After research was done on dreams by Hobson McCarley in the late 70s, many in psychology were led to believe that dreams are really nothing more than the result of noisy, random neural impulses that happen during our sleep. But is this really a good account of dreams? Do they really have no purpose whatsoever? After all, these dreams can be quite terrifying for us, and confusing. They also give us the anxiety-inducing ideas of thinking about the Matrix possibility and Descartes' evil demon. Why couldn't we just simply sleep peacefully, with no dreams? Or why couldn't all our dreams simply be good dreams, instead of terrifying ones? Evolutionary psychology might be able to give us some answers to these questions, and give an account of dreams that explains them as more than just random neural impulses. Finnish cognitive scientist and philosopher of mind Antti Revonsuo, as well as psychologists Michael S. Franklin and Michael J. Zeifer, have tried to do just this, and give an evolutionary account of dreams that explains dreams as being a rehearsal of sorts. Not quite like this rehearsal, but a rehearsal that's a completely mental rehearsal. But to best explain these evolutionary accounts, it's useful to understand why these psychologists have an issue with accounts of dreams that make them nothing more than noise and the results of random neural firings and impulses. One of the reasons why dreams might often be mistaken as simply being the results of some random neural firing or impulses is people are only focused on the crazy parts of dreams, the seeming instability, the seeming wackiness, the seeming out-of-this-worldness. The fact that oftentimes it seems as though our dreams are totally inexplicable, often seeming to exist without any sort of order or reason or logic in them. And because of that, one might be led to believe that only random firings in the brain that are unordered, unlogical, without any structure, could possibly explain something as unstructured and seemingly crazy as these dreams that we experience. But Revonsuo, Franklin, and Zeifer challenge this idea and point out that dreams are actually overall very impressively organized representations of lived reality, which incorporate stable parts of our waking life into what we experience as dreams. There's a coherence and organization to these dreams that allows a storyline and memory to be formed about them. It's not as though they're totally baseless, they have a root in what we experience in reality. Would just random neural impulses be able to actually explain this sort of organization and coherence in dreams? There does exist some stability here, a lot of wackiness of course, but there is stability in these dreams, which is what Revonsuo, Franklin, and Zeifer have an issue with and want to include in their account of dreams. After all, dreams aren't just simply some random chaotic swirl and mess of phenomenal experience, one that might be expected if its cause truly was just random neural activity. When you think about it a bit further, our dreams do have some organization, some coherence, some stability of sorts, that allows them to be stable and convincing replications and simulations of what we experience in our wakeful lives. There may of course be some crazy aspects to our dreams, but overall they often do convince us that we're in a lived reality. After all, consider Descartes' point. At times when we're dreaming, we don't truly realize it. We think we really are in a wakeful experience. This is a very complex and often convincing simulation, one that Revonsuo, Franklin, and Zeifer think is a very complex thing that likely isn't just simply a random by chance result, but something that was crafted, perhaps crafted by evolution, for a purpose that increases our fitness and ability to survive in an ancestral environment. Consider this following video clip of a cat that's sleeping, but actively acting out its dream. As we can see, it doesn't look like the cat is simply acting in a very random way. It looks like a very organized way of replication, a complex simulation of the cat going after prey, of doing activities that it would in its wakeful life.
This remarkable film shows a cat in the middle of a night's sleep. Now, believe it or not, the cat is still asleep, but because some of its nerve pathways have been cut, it's acting out its dreams. Normally, when we dream, we're effectively paralyzed from the neck down. But that paralysis has been bypassed in this cat. Its brain shows all the signs of REM sleep, but its muscle activities suggest an exciting dream life chasing flies and mice. If our muscles weren't paralyzed, we too would probably act out our dreams in this way. Perhaps it's fortunate for our partners that we don't.
Take that last comment as you will. But as you can see, it's very unlikely that this is just simply random activity. There's an organized simulation going on here, one that encompasses things that the organism would be experiencing in real life. This is something that Revonsuo, Franklin, and Zeifer want to build upon and give an evolutionary explanation of, to explain how the simulation might very well be an adaptation of sorts that can help us in the waking experience by providing us with a simulated reality in which we can practice and prepare for the waked experience. Revonsuo believes that evolution chose this simulated reality for us because it allows us to practice and rehearse for the numerous threats that a human might experience in their ancestral environment. If a human is able to mentally practice and rehearse in this way, then Revonsuo asserts that they'll be better fit and better able to deal with those threats in real life, in their waking life. For example, imagine a hunter in the ancestral environment, one who in his waking life has to confront and maybe hunt really large and dangerous animals. If he was to practice doing this threatening scenario in real life, well, there's a lot of risk for injury, for death, for many bad things. But if he also have a dream about this, in which he could have a realistic simulation, in which he could practice confronting such an animal, then there's a lot less risk for injury, for death, and he gains practice confronting that animal in the simulation. He becomes more conscientious about the threat, and when he awakes in his real life, he will have a simulated experience of dealing with this threat. You may of course be asking, how could this be effective practice and rehearsal for the real world, for the waking life though? After all, if he was dreaming, he wouldn't be actually moving around, practicing that coordination with his muscles of confronting this sort of animal. But do realize that while that might not be happening, there's still a mental rehearsal going on. The same brain regions, same cognitive capacities are still being activated and are engaging with that simulated reality, strengthening and readying themselves. And once he re-enters his wakeful state, those same mental capacities will still be there and will help him out move around in the real world in his wakeful life, wakeful reality, one in which he really does confront the threat of this dangerous animal, but one in which he'll be more prepared. Revonsuo references some very interesting research done on dream recall and dream content. This research found that subjects who face threats, in the case of this study, Palestinian children who were living in a very violent and dangerous area of Gaza, one which there was obviously many threats facing them, had better dream recall, had more negatively emotional dreams, and most interestingly, had less bizarre dreams, and had dreams that were more representative of their encountered reality, a reality full of threats. This research seems to suggest that when we're encountered with threatening and dangerous environments, we tend to dream more, but not only just dream more, we tend to dream about those very threats, that very danger. It seems to suggest that evolution has possibly primed us to do this very thing, so that when threats are encountered, we get more mental practice with them, more mental rehearsal, a mental simulation with them. That'll increase our abilities to actually counter them, to actually overcome them, and to survive through them. This new perspective seems to really change the conversation on nightmares. Revonsuo points out that oftentimes we see nightmares as perhaps an abnormal psychology of sorts, something that should be taken away, something that doesn't really have a purpose, something that's perhaps an illness of sorts. But as he points out, there might be a purpose to it. It might help us deal with threats in the real world. It might be preparing us, rehearsing us. It's perhaps an uncomfortable experience, but as he points out, natural selection isn't actually acting for the sake of our own comfort. It's acting for our survivability, which this terror in our nightmares might be helping with. Revonsuo himself has conducted empirical research, which seems to support his hypothesis here. In this data, traumatized children, who face many more threats than non-traumatized children and non-traumatized adults, were shown to have dreams that encompass many more threats, including threats of aggression and threats to life, threats that obviously would have been present in the ancestral environment. Such results may suggest that we have an innate capacity within us to dream more about threats and simulate them when we're confronted with them in our lived experience in wakeful environment. Further data produced by Revonsuo demonstrates that in this study, when participants were awoken during REM sleep and were able to recall their dreams, there is at least one threatening event or threat encompassed in the dream in a majority of cases. This seems to suggest that, as Revonsuo says, our dreams are possibly made to deal with threats, made to encompass terror, and to help us prepare and rehearse with them mentally before we go out into the real waking world. Since the aforementioned research seems to suggest that our dreams become much less bizarre and much more connected to reality when we face threats in real life, perhaps bizarre and unthreatening dreams are simply the result of there not being enough threats in our wakeful experiences for the dreams to try and properly simulate. Perhaps our dreams become confused and just simply try to latch onto whatever experiences they can in the absence of any proper threat to properly simulate and prepare for. Interestingly enough, though, the COVID-19 pandemic may have actually provided evidence that backs up Revonsuo's claims of dreams being threat rehearsals, as it seems as though, with a universal threat facing society, there's a universal type of dream that's happening that's becoming very common amongst many people around the world. Let's see this video to learn more.
Living in the slowed down time of the COVID lockdown might seem like an opportunity to catch up on lost sleep. But since mid-March, the number of Google searches starting with weird quarantine dreams has surpassed 200 million. Psychologists say more and more of their patients started complaining about weird, anxiety-filled and stressful dreams after the pandemic set in.
Vivid dreams, for example, and changes in sleep patterns can be associated with various types of stressors or even with post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think that we may see that as a factor. This is a collective trauma, which a collective trauma means that it's an event, a negative event that is very widely experienced in the population, that people have direct exposure to, as well as they can be exposed to it via stories that others tell them or through the media.
Another expert, Harvard Medical School professor Deidre Barrett, has been compiling the pandemic dreams descriptions since mid-March. Before the pandemic, she has studied similar occurrences linked to the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
They're clusters of content themes, like some people dream about getting the virus, they're noticing they can't breathe, they're spiking a fever, and they're afraid they're getting the virus in the dream. Another large group have metaphors for the virus, and the biggest subcluster of those are bug dreams. I've seen just dozens and dozens of different kinds of bugs attacking dreamers. And I think that's partly because in English, the slang word for virus is bug.
Even though the coronavirus is not a predator but an unseen enemy, the level of threat is still quite high, says psychological professor Roxanne Pritchard.
Threat rehearsal, that during our dream life, we're able to practice disaster scenarios that we don't get to do every day. So dreaming gives us a chance to kind of run those sequences or those programs so we know how to escape from predators, we know what to do when there's a disaster, and we can kind of keep those sequences fresh. So that's one sort of evolutionary hypothesis to the purpose of stress dreams, nightmare dreams, fighting dreams.
Obviously, there's a little bit of bizarreness with a thing like the bug dream, but overall, these things do seem to be reactions to and rehearsals of the threatening situation of getting infected with COVID-19, getting infected with a virus, a threat that certainly faced our ancestors. And the fact that COVID-19 became a universal threat, a threat that everyone was facing in their lived experience, would explain why so many people were getting dreams that involved that threat. They were encountering this threat and their dreams were manifesting that threat and rehearsing and preparing them for it. How does it prepare them for it? Well, let's consider this hypothetical example. Let's take this woman on the left, for example. Let's suppose that in her waking experience, she takes the threat of COVID-19 very seriously, recognizing and realizing it as a real threat in her waking experience. And in her dream experience, she experiences a dream, a simulation of that very threat, a simulation of confronting or being infected with COVID-19, a simulation which is quite terrifying, perhaps quite scary and concerning to her. So when she wakes up, after that concern, that terror, that experience, she'll be more likely in her waking life to take higher, proper precautions, wearing a mask, wearing gloves, respecting public safety measures, perhaps going overboard, and with that, being more likely to survive the pandemic. The QAnon shaman here, on the other hand, perhaps doesn't have as great chances. If he doesn't truly recognize this threat in waking life, if he dismisses COVID-19 as simply a hoax, as simply non-existent, well then his dreaming state won't have anything to work with, won't have any sort of threat to rehearse and properly prepare for. And since he's not manifesting a concern and a preparedness through his dreams of threat simulations, well, he'll be less likely to take proper precautions to realize the severity of the threat, to ingrain a deep concern about COVID-19, and thus his chances of survival will go down. That headdress will offer him, unfortunately, minimal protection. Revonsuo also acknowledges the interesting fact that activities such as physical action, running, walking, sexual activity, talking, speech comprehension, spatial reasoning, are a lot more represented in dreams than activities such as reading, writing, typing, calculating, and arithmetic. And he explains this by saying that these later activities simply aren't really involved in confronting difficult, threatening situations. This talk of abilities and activities, though, does raise the question of whether this dream rehearsal can rehearse other things, other activities that don't pertain directly to threatening scenarios. There are accounts of dreams that do suggest that perhaps this sort of rehearsal can be applied to things that aren't related to threats, things that were also beneficial to our ancestors. Perhaps it's not all threat-oriented, perhaps there's other abilities that were still useful and beneficial in the ancestral environment. Let's take a look at what Harvard dream specialist Deidre Barrett has to say about this.
What about dreams as a conduit for problem solving, creative problem solving? There have been lots of stories of people, scientists have reported great insights coming through dreams, artists who've said, I got this idea for a novel through a dream. Why would that happen?
This is a Deirdre question.
Well, I think that, again, that dreams are very much just thinking in a different biochemical state. And when I've studied the problem solving, the Committee of Sleep book that you mentioned is mainly a collection of the anecdotes of artists using their dreams and scientists using their dreams, and some description of why that is. But I've also done research with undergraduates where they were working on a particular problem of their choice, much more mundane, down to earth than discovering the structure of benzene. And when I had them just practice looking at the problem that they had not yet solved right at bedtime, telling themselves they wanted to dream about it, in the course of a week of doing this, half of them had a dream that was about the problem, and about 1/4 of them had a dream that solved it. And that's the highest that I or anyone else has found, and I think that's because A, they're problems they needed to solve anyway, they have some personal attachment, and B, they're fairly easy problems that with enough time they would have solved awake. And in studies where you take difficult brain teasers or something where they're not as interested and they're harder, you get a lower rate of solving, but you still get some. And in that and the anecdotes, The solved problems, a dream can end up solving any kind of problem, advanced mathematics, anything, once in a while. But the solved problems really cluster in two areas. One is anything that benefits from vivid visualization. So the visual artists, more than any other artists, say that they often use their dreams in their work. They often, get a great idea from a painting, from a dream. But in the sciences, it's less likely to be the very abstract science, and it's much more likely to be inventors, like my friend Paul Horowitz at Harvard designs the controls for telescopes. And it's a matter of really visualizing how to arrange the lenses or how to make a circuit for some chip. And he says that anytime he's stuck on some part of designing a telescope, that he has a dream where he sees this. And these kind of visualizable inventions seem overrepresented in science. And then the other cluster, besides visualization, which I think has to do with that secondary visual cortex, is the one that has to do with the primary, with our prefrontal, which is that if you're really stuck on the problem, the dreams sometimes solve it by thinking outside the box. Like if an expert is just trying and can't do it awake, that very often the reason they're stuck is because the conventional wisdom is wrong for this particular thing. They have to think in some way that they're kind of self-censoring. And this area that's stamped down is exactly the one that goes, no, that's not the way to do a geometry proof. No, that's not the way a molecule would be constructed.
Do you have favorite stories of scientific breakthroughs through dreams?
Well, the most famous one, but it illustrates both these, is Kekulé and the benzene ring. He had discovered what the atoms that make up the benzene molecule were, and now scientists can just take an electron microscope and look at the molecule and see how they're arranged, but microscopes were not nearly that good in those days. So he was trying to figure out exactly how they lined up and were attached to each other. And at that time, all known molecules were some kind of straight line with right angle side chains coming off as their physical structure. And so he was taking the atoms he knew were in benzene and trying to arrange it in ways that would account for benzene's chemical properties, and nothing worked. And so he fell asleep and dreamed that he saw atoms dancing around in front of him, that the atoms began to join together. He said forming snakes, but clearly snakes made of atoms. And that finally one snake reached around and took its tail in its mouth. And he woke up realizing that benzene was a closed ring structure, which was the first known molecule that was. And that both illustrates that the dream was thinking outside the box. It could be a ring, doesn't have to be a straight line, in a way that he wasn't letting himself. But also the dream was visualizing it, and more vividly than we assume he could awake. So that's one of my favorites, because it's an important discovery. It captures both those elements.
Franklin and Zeifer also pivoted away from Revonsuo's threat-oriented account of dreams by also proposing that perhaps dreams are a bit more general and help all of our abilities, help practice and rehearse many different types of abilities, such as motor tasks, sport and musical abilities, even social abilities and social situations, which could all perhaps be simulated, practiced and rehearsed in dreams. There would obviously once again be no actual physical practice of these activities, but the relevant brain regions would still be in use. They would still be exercised by the dream simulation. And past research has shown that solely mental practice and motor imagery of such activities of musical abilities, sports abilities, motor abilities, even perhaps social abilities, can perhaps be increased through that mental imagery and practice alone without any sort of physical involvement. So perhaps our dreams are a gym of sorts, a mental gym. And this might explain why as little as 10 to 20 minutes of actual motor practice have considerable impacts on the brain. Perhaps these are just simply the tip of the iceberg. Perhaps beneath it is the dream state, in which a lot more practice exists and goes on as we sleep. Might also explain why children and infants have higher demands for sleep while they're developing. Perhaps they need that mental gym to properly develop and practice skills. A practice, though, which is solely mental, and perhaps saves energy, not having to spend any energy on any sort of physical practice, only a mental, which is perhaps energy-wise a much more efficient form of practice. To end on an interesting note and question, Franklin and Zeifer discuss a bit about lucid dreaming, which is when a dreamer becomes aware that they're in a dream state, and with their awoken consciousness can interact and manipulate the dream world. And such lucid dreaming proves to be a skill that can be learned and developed. Could lucid dreaming empower us to actively choose, manipulate, and change what's being rehearsed and practiced mentally during our dreams? Could one become their own rehearsal director for their own dream theater at night? Could there be a lot of opportunity here to improve our abilities if we're able to actively choose what's being rehearsed at night? But is there a risk here? Could we be interfering with important things that evolution has planned for our dreams by implementing our own desires and choices into what's being practiced and rehearsed? Could we be missing something, kicking some important practice rehearsal out of our dreams if we make such choices? It's an interesting question. Perhaps it's time to get to work on it.